has made a breathtaking departure from foreign policy. It is quite clearly Donald Trump's world. I never thought I would be saying these words, but the United States of America has voted on Russia's side at the United Nations on Ukraine, while India has abstained. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. A fascinating deep dive into geopolitics today will be asking how Trump and Trump's upending of US foreign policy might change the world as well as India's interests in it. In a breathtaking departure from US foreign policy, the Americans have voted alongside the Russians on Ukraine, even as India has abstained. In other words, today you could theoretically argue that the Americans are more pro Russia than India is. Remember, all these months, India came under enormous Western pressure to take more of a position on the Russia Ukraine conflict. India refused to do so, citing multilateralism and arguing that it would be guided by its own interests. Trump's dramatic turnaround of US foreign policy leaves the Modi government with the last laugh. But given the fact that Trump has made a slew of statements talking about why money from USAID has been coming to India, his fifth statement said, why the hell is any money going to India for voter turnout? It's unclear what Trump's ascendancy could mean, not just for the world order, but also for Indian interests. To look at this dramatic departure from US foreign policy, let me introduce our guests on the program today as we try and make sense of Trump's world. Joining me now is Tavleen Singh, veteran author and columnist. Welcome to the program. And also joining me is military veteran General Rakesh Sharma. Thank you very much, sir. Welcome both of you to the program. Let me play out a clip. What happens when Trump is asked at the Oval Office with Macron sitting right next to him, is Putin a dictator? There was a time when if you asked any American leader this question, you know what the answer would be. But guess what? This is what Trump says.
President, you called Zelensky a dictator. Would you use the same words regarding Putin?
I don't use those words lightly. I think that we're going to see how it all works out. Let's see what happens. I think we have a chance of a really good settlement between various countries. And, you know, you're talking about Europe, and you're talking about Ukraine is part of that whole situation. The other side has a lot of support also. So let's see how it all works out. It might work out. Look, you can never make up lives. The one thing you can make up the money, but you can't make up the lives. A lot of lives lost. I think probably a lot more lives than people are talking about. It's been a rough war, but I think we're close to getting it solved.
Question about Doge, sir?
The eventual vote, as we now know, the Americans sided with the Russians, India abstained. It really is Donald Trump's world, and we're all just trying to catch up. Tavleen, we've been part of some heated debates on whether India had taken the correct position on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. As it turns out, the Modi government is going to say, we told you so. We were right in being cautious. We, as in India, was right in being cautious. India was right in not taking a categorical position. And guess what? India has abstained, and the Americans have voted with the Russians. I mean, do you think to that extent, Jay Shankar's philosophy of multilateralism has paid dividends, leaving India in a kind of win-win position? Or do you think Trump is highly undependable?
Well, I think that Trump is undependable. He might have a different, because you see, the one thing that we have to remember is there's no policy here. Policy takes time. You make a decision. This is just the president of America freelancing. Policy means, you know, people sitting together in a room and working out and saying, you know, what are we going to do and what are we not going to do? But personally, you know, I feel very strongly about what happened, what the Russians did in Ukraine, because in my book, a country, a democratic country that is invaded by a dictator, there are no two, you know, there's no two ways of looking at that situation. And I stand by my view that I think that India should have talked more strongly in favor of democracy. And as for America, which is, you know, I mean, the oldest democracy in the world, shame on America. Shame on America. They're in with North Korea and who's the other two? North Korea, America, and who's the third country that has voted with the Russians?
Yeah, even I need to check that. It just slipped my mind. I'm just asking my producers to pull out the third country. Can we have it on our banners, please? But yes, I mean, when you say shame on America, I do remember that you had said that India should have taken a more principled position. Hungary is the third country, by the way. Hungary, North Korea,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Well
and the
done,
Americans.
America. Huh? Well done, Trump, to be in that club. Really. I mean, I'm just so appalled by what's happened. There are limits to, for a start, you can examine, don't call it policy. This doesn't seem to be policy. Policy takes working out. India has a policy. And in fact, the policy has been made very clear. The Prime Minister himself says, I've never been on anyone's side. We are on the side of peace. So we've never been neutral. We're on the side of peace. That's a pretty good, that's a principled position. But America, that shining city on the hill, and what happened to all that? It sends a message that is so ugly and so frightening that, it's hard to talk about.
And it's interesting that you say that India actually does have a position. Modi has shrugged off the criticism that India is neutral. The Prime Minister said India is on the side of peace. He said this sitting with Trump before we knew that Trump was going to take such an extreme turnaround on Ukraine. And as you remind us, voting alongside North Korea and Hungary, what happened to the famed American democracy. But before I come to General Sharma, let's play out what the Prime Minister said on Russia, Ukraine, with Donald Trump sitting by his side.
जहां तक रूस और यूक्रेन के बीच का लड़ाई का सवाल है, मुझे खुशी है कि राष्ट्रपति ट्रंप ने शांति के प्रयासों का इनिशिएटिव लेते हुए कल राष्ट्रपति पुतिन से बात की है। दुनिया का एक सोच रही है कि भारत न्यूट्रल है। भारत न्यूट्रल नहीं है। भारत का अपना पक्ष है और भारत का पक्ष है शांति। हम पहले दिन से ही, और मैंने राष्ट्रपति पुतिन को उनकी मौजूदगी में मीडिया के सामने कहा था कि ये समय युद्ध का नहीं है, और मेरा एक कन्विक्शन है कि समस्याओं का समाधान युद्ध के मैदानों में नहीं निकलता है, वो टेबल पर चर्चा करके ही निकलता है।
The Prime Minister there rejecting the criticism that has actually been coming from Western nations about India's refusal to take a stand. India was accused of being a fence sitter. Modi there saying, we're not fence sitting, we're saying work towards peace. The era of war is over. But looking at Trump, there's so many ironies here. India has abstained. There was a time when India's abstentions on Russia were criticized by Tavleen, among others, for not going far enough on the principles to uphold democracy. The Americans have voted with the Russians. What is actually going on here? How do we make sense of a Trump-driven world order, and how will India, or how should India adjust to it?
Oh, thank you, Barkha, for inviting me. Now, the fact is that President Trump got elected on an agenda, and he spoke his agenda, which actually comes across back to that MAGA, what he talks about, for years altogether. First, Trump 1.0 and subsequently now. So there is an agenda. He is following his agenda, and he says for him, United States come first. So when he talks of Ukraine, he says that I want 50% of your natural resources, which are counted as $11 trillion. So everything is transactional in nature. It is all to make America great. Now, absolutely what you have said, the flip-flop that we have seen in the American policy could not have been spoken about in the month of November before the elections took place. There is a gap, there is a chasm between Europe and America now. It's a very severe, serious change which have happened after First World War. Hundreds of years, we see a great difference between in the Atlantic Ocean between them, and there are shifting alliances. So there is a problematic situation. Europe is probably getting independent of United States. What it seems, if you see the voting issue, even the United States resolution in United Nations, European nations came up with amendments to that, And the Europe, when the finally United States had to abstain from its own resolution because the resolution wording got changed because Europe came up with some kind of amendments. So there is a dramatic shift happening in the world here, and we have to accept it. In 1 year, the last year's resolution had about 140 people voting for. This year it dropped down to 93. The world people, the countries are changing their attitude. So I think our policies, what the Prime Minister rightly said, we are on the side of peace. We are also on the side of our own national interests. How can we forget that we have national interests which are important for us to have relations with Ukraine and also important for us to retain relations with Russia. So, our policies are absolutely correct because nobody knows how things will change. And as rightly pointed out, there is unpredictability here. President Trump's policies are evolving every day. Yesterday night, President Putin came out without notice on a TV channel, and he spoke such gaga words about President Trump that they were, the best thing that has happened to the world is President Trump. It wasn't even planned, but his speech was worth listening to, only to say the kind of relationship that's developing between President Putin and President Trump. And now, as you rightly said, President Putin is not the dictator. The dictator is President Zelensky. And also President Trump said, and I'll end here by saying that the war was started by Ukraine. Now, actually, if you say go back to history of 20 years, what happens in 90s after Russia came up and 2008, and you can develop a lot of histories. But who started the war? It is now being said by President Trump that the war was started by Ukraine. Let's evolve as things say and stick to our national interests and our policies as we stand.
Okay, I think that is evident that India will be guided by national interest, but it's not clear whether it was generally believed that Trump would be great for India. Now, Trump has stirred the proverbial hornet's nest with his very sweeping but unexplained comments on USAID money coming to India, and he's made not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 comments on this. And I'm going to play out the 5th one. The amount has changed, by the way. He started with 21 million. In this statement, he has said 18 million. He's described it as kickbacks, and at one point he said the money went to my friend Prime Minister Modi. At most other points, he's of course spoken about voter turnout, and that's the point that Tavleen is making. Trump is freelancing. How should we be responding? In the middle of all this, let me play out Trump's 5th comment on USAID funding coming to India, ostensibly to increase voter turnout.
Process in Moldova, $29 million goes to strengthen the political landscape and help them out so that they can vote for a radical left communist in Bangladesh. You had to see who they supported. You wouldn't believe, yeah, you would believe it. Nobody in this room would be in that group. $20 million for fiscal federalism and $19 million for biodiversity in Nepal. $47 million for improving learning outcomes in Asia. $18 million for helping India with its elections. Why the hell? Why don't we just go to all paper ballots? Let them help us with their elections, right? Voter ID. Wouldn't that be nice? We're giving money to India for elections. They don't need money. They take advantage of us pretty good. One of the highest tariff nations in the world. We try and sell something, they have a 200% tariff, and then we're giving them a lot of money to help them with their election.
I see Ambassador Veena Sikri has just joined us. Good to see you. Good to see you, ma'am. Are you able to make sense of the Trump world? We were just discussing 2 things: the breathtaking departure from U.S. foreign policy. Now Putin isn't the dictator, Zelensky is. The fact that India abstained, U.S. voted alongside Russia, and as Tavleen pointed out, alongside also North Korea and Hungary. So what happened to the famed American democracy? And of course, Trump's continued commentary on USAID money coming to India. How do you make sense of Trump's world, Ambassador Veena Sikri?
Well, I can only make sense of it if you relate it to what he promised in his own election manifesto. So that, I think, is the most important aspect to look at it. For example, if you look at the USAID or imbroglio, then straight away you see that he had said this, that he was going to end the deep state. and that is what he promised in his election manifesto. And you're seeing that he is trying to do that, and all these USAID programs, whether it is the funding for Nepal, etc. We know that it went maybe through the Open Foundation of Soros, or it went through NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, and its various affiliates. And this money reached Bangladesh, and in Bangladesh, in the media, they openly writing about the programs being run by the US Embassy in Dhaka at that time. Various programs for students and others, which
Yeah.
were meant to so that was part, what he's saying about USAID is part of what he had said before the elections. He talked about the chaos in Bangladesh and so on. So I think that was one. Now, if you look at the voting in the UN, yes, it's very difficult to make sense of it, including what he did in the Security Council and his closest allies, abstaining. But again, I think we have to see this as part of his extreme hurry to bring peace in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And he's determined to do it because if you see what is happening in the UN in parallel with what is happening during President Macron's visit to Washington, D.C., and his joint press conference with Trump, then you see that Macron is now almost relented, after taking that very strong stand in Paris and calling a summit of the Europeans to see how to deal with Trump. Now you see them, shaking hands and hugging each other, and Trump saying, yes, you're my friend, and Macron patting him on the back, and so it's all part of this extreme, again, his manifesto.
Ambassador Secretary, before you joined, Tavleen was making the argument, shame on America, what happened to famed American democracy. You're locating it within Trump's massive hurry to bring peace and say, I ended this war. I think he wants to take credit for ending the war. But why? The Americans could have abstained. They didn't have to vote with. Sorry, Tavleen, you wanted to interject before Master Secretary responds?
I just wanted to make one small point. Do you know Reagan brought down that wall in Berlin? Reagan made peace. He actually achieved it. And he did it by telling Russia the truth about Russia. I mean, it was the Soviet Union then, but he didn't pretend that it wasn't a dictatorship. So in my view, Trump hasn't I don't think that he has the ability to understand geopolitics in a really sincere way, because I mean in a studied intelligent way, because he thinks that in Bangladesh they've elected a communist. They haven't. They've elected, he just said they elected this communist. They've elected Islamists. And how is that in America's
I mean,
interest?
they haven't elected anybody yet. But
No, I
Ambassador
mean,
Secretary,
what I'm saying is,
And I think if he's opposing a regime change operation, the kind of what happened in Bangladesh, I'm all for that, because that was a completely wrong activity done by the deep state of the USA through Pakistan and the Islamists in the army and using the Jamaat-e-Islami. It was completely
okay. Let's go step by step.
democracy.
Ambassador Secretary, let's go step by step, because we're confusing Bangladesh and the Ukraine vote. Let's start there. Okay. I think the point that Tavleen is making is Trump can do the same. India has voted in a series of abstentions at the UN, right? Often coming under enormous pressure from the West, even critics at home saying, why aren't you taking more of a position? The Americans could have abstained. They didn't have to vote with Russia. Why do you think Trump voted with Russia?
Look, I think the same President Reagan also ended the Cold War in a different way. And President Trump is trying to end this Cold War II, or whatever you may call it, whether he achieves it or doesn't achieve it. But I think he is forcing the Europeans to think about a normalcy in the relations in Europe. And I think that it is important for Europe, because otherwise Europe is putting itself into a position of strategic irrelevance. If they don't see the writing on the wall and recognize that they have to have peace in Europe, and they cannot send troops there to fight the Russian troops, which would be really, reigniting Third World War. And now he's agreed, President Macron has agreed with President Trump, okay, that if the troops are there, they will be as peacekeepers. So we are trying to solve every inch of the way, every objection that the Europeans are showing, every opposition that they've been showing to President Trump, he's trying to bring them down to a meeting point so that, as he says, in a week's time, Zelensky will be there and an agreement will be signed, formally ending the war. I think one has to look at it in a bigger way, because one has to also realize that part of the reason why the whole imbroglio in Ukraine started was this agreement between the State Department and the Ukrainian government in November 2021, which actually talked about taking on Russia together and achieving what America was looking for in Europe to end Putin's
Yeah.
presidency and so on. So one has to look at that and to see that when that red line was crossed, then, according to what President Putin has himself explained, he had no option except to go in as he did in early 2022. So I think that if we look at it in a bigger way and not in a question of one resolution, who's voting which way, who's voting with North Korea, who's voting, I think those are very minor things. These UN resolutions, every day there's a new resolution, and people who voted differently a week back change their minds. But right
Okay,
now, I am looking at it in the context of peace for Ukraine. I have been in the UN. I've been there myself for almost more than 3 years, almost 4 years. So I know a lot of how these voting patterns change and rechange. That's
So
not the
overall,
issue.
okay. Basically, you think this is it's a welcome development. Your device is going topsy turvy, just like foreign policy in the way that we understand it. So I think it's a metaphor for the world we live in. Trump has turned our worlds upside down. General Sharma, you wanted to respond to Ambassador Sikri. Go ahead, General Sharma.
Yeah. So in one day alone, America voted 3 different types. In yesterday alone, on the Ukrainian resolution, they rejected it. On their own resolution, they abstained it. But the United Nations Security Council resolution, again given by the United States, they had the resolution passed. So in one day, there's a different thing. Their own resolution, they had to abstain because of the amendments brought across by the European Union to their resolution.
Correct.
So the kind of confusion is total. Who could have said yesterday morning that the 3 resolutions will go in this manner? That's the kind of world changing. We have to be on our feet all the time because things are changing in such manners.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We didn't get into that granular detail about how the Americans handled their own resolution, and that's a very important point that General Sharma made. I need to just take quick last comments, Tavleen, before I give Ambassador Sikri the last word. Veena Sikri says, doesn't matter if in one resolution, Hungary, North Korea, and the Americans voted on the same side. These are all minor issues. If the war ends, that's what's important. Tavleen?
I don't know if the war is going to end. You're going to let Putin off the hook. And in 2 years, he'll reinvade. Putin is directly responsible for this, and he is the dictator. Look what he did to Navalny. Look how he's running Russia at the moment. I mean, the man is, in my view, a monster. And of course, we're getting cheap oil from them. So it's our national interest to for our policy people not to call him a monster. But I have no hesitation in saying that, as far as I'm concerned, I don't want to be on the same side as Kim Jong-un and Putin and Orban and for America to be there, that to me is truly shameful.
Okay, Ambassador Sikri, last word to you. Putin's record as a dictator speaks for itself. Yes, there's a limit to which India will get involved in that debate. That's fine. We're going to be guided by our own interests. Are our own interests thus far being served by Trump and the way he's directing us at the steering wheel of the world?
Yeah. Well, certainly, if you look at the outcome of Prime Minister Modi's visit to USA, to Washington, D.C., I think it was a very good visit because it established a good equation, a good understanding. And we now know we met all our the ministerial colleagues. They have all met the key figures, and we are sure how it's going to pan out. And even about Bangladesh, you heard what President Trump said to our Prime Minister in the press conference and so on. So obviously, we are ready to work with the Trump administration. And we are also ready to work with the Bangladesh administration. As we have told them, our own strategic autonomy, our own interests are paramount. So I think we should understand it in that context. And India's voting also has to be understood in that context. In many cases, even on the Middle East resolutions, we voted one way or the other way, depending on our own understanding at that point in time. I don't go along with those words about President Putin as dictator, because many people say a lot of things about President Biden also, and what happened with all the huge amounts of money he gave to Ukraine, and that money has simply disappeared. President Zelensky himself says half of it we don't know where it is. So what is it? I mean, are we talking about a dictator Zelensky? Are we talking about a corrupt Zelensky? What are we talking about, So I think we should not pass value judgments. I'm not in favor of passing value judgments. I'm more in favor of seeing a situation where the Ukrainian-Russian imbroglio comes to an end, the crisis comes to an end, the shooting comes to an end, and they are able to continue their peace talks on a level playing field and see what they can get. I think that we have to look at it like that. Otherwise, the world will be in a perpetual state of conflict. And we don't want a third world war coming and, crashing over our heads anytime soon. I think we'd much rather focus on maritime security, the Quad, and so many other interests in our area that we have to protect our prime interests on. So I would not actually lose much sleep over the UN resolutions and the voting. I would wait to see what happens when the final agreement is finalized and Zelensky comes to Washington, D.C. to sign it.
I don't know if it's appropriate to quote the Chinese, but we certainly live in interesting times, is all I'll say. I'll leave it there for now. There's a lot to follow up on what happens, as you said. I mean, just imagine if Trump's first big achievement, he gets to say that he ended this particular war. We leave it there. Tavleen Singh, Ambassador Sikri, General Sharma, thank you. And to our audience, thank you and see you soon. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.